Disc jockey, drop the bass. Now the heads.
Hello lovelies. Today you're going to be joining me on a deep dive into academia as it relates to role-playing games. We're going to be taking a look at the paper. I'm going to have to read this off because paper titles are always so stupidly long. We're going to be taking a look at Privilege, Power and Dungeons and Dragons, How Systems Shape Racial and Gender Identities in Tabletop Role-Playing Games by Antero Garcia. I hope I pronounced that right. So I guess I should establish my bona fides. I finished college, but didn't go any further than that. But I am an autodidact. I have taught myself a great deal. I have produced a huge amount of work, both literary and game-related. I've been playing games for over 30 years. I've been a professional game designer and writer for over 20 years. I have been involved in gaming at the national and international level. I've LARPed, I've done card games, board games, war games, role-playing games, computer games. I know games, and I've been involved in the gaming community and support structure and the professional gaming community for a long time and on a wide scale. I know games. Okay, obviously this is all personal perspective and so on, and that's a limitation. But that's where I'm coming at all this from. I'm not trying to say I'm an authority per se, but just know that that's where I'm coming from, and I know what I'm talking about. Your mileage may vary, but I have a broad base of experience. And also, despite not having the academic training or indoctrination, depending on your point of view, I think I can determine what he's saying and translate it somewhat, and show how it's interacting with the real world, or what else might be going on. So I'm coming in this to fisk it, basically, to go through and rip it a new one. But I want to do it on relatively friendly terms. And as well as my experience and knowledge, my authority, if you will, I also want to point out that I am for social justice, but against social justice warriors. That might seem like a contradiction to you, but a social justice warrior is someone who takes it to an extreme. There's a joke, about what the difference is, and the difference is that if there's stairs into a library, someone who's for social justice will add a ramp. Someone who's a social justice warrior will remove the stairs so they don't trigger anyone in a wheelchair. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. I often agree with the aims, not always, but often, but disagree with the tactics that these people engage in, and this kind of critique. And I see this kind of paper, this kind of moral panic around computer games, role-playing games, all of it, as a retread of the satanic panic. So that's the angle I'm coming at it from. I will try to be charitable, but there's no telling how it's going to go. As I go through this, I'm going to swap the picture and the background music, whether I'm talking as myself or reading off part of the paper. Privilege, Power and Dungeons and Dragons, How Systems Shape Racial and Gender Identities in Tabletop Role-Playing Games by Antero Garcia. Abstract. This article takes a cultural historical approach to analysing how systems shape the assumptions, identities and experiences of their users, focusing on how the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons is built on a system of play that has grown and shifted over the course of 40 years. This study emphasises the central role that systems play in mediating the experiences of participants by focusing on depictions of gender, race and power in Dungeons and Dragons as a singular cultural practice. This study highlights how researchers must attend to cultural production both around and within systems. Now, purely from the title and the abstract, I think anyone with any experience with this kind of thing, the ongoing culture war for want of a better word, they'll know that this is basically going to be an excuse for a lot of white male geek bashing. And that's unfortunate, because there are few things in this world that are or have been as open and welcoming to people as D&D, even since its inception. So I'll be interested to see what he finds problematic further in the paper. 40 years since the original release of the world's first role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons, the preface to the 5th edition of the game invokes a self-created mythology of how the game's Midwestern creators defined a genre of play. Since its creation by gamers Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, D&D has spawned numerous editions, playing variants, and other gaming systems. In addition, as the harbinger of an entire genre of codified tabletop play and video game tropes, D&D has significantly shaped the landscape of pop culture as portrayed in books, on screens, and via gaming consoles. The group of friends that forever altered the landscape of gaming and pop culture did so through the authorship of a rules system that dictated the constraints and ideologies for meaning-making within RPGs. I think it's important to ground Dungeons & Dragons in its historical origin. I mean, if you think about when it was created in the mid-70s, these were people who had been greatly influenced by the 60s, and there was an explosion of fantasy literature and so forth throughout the 60s and 70s. There was still the kind of free love culture going on. University radicalism was very different to what we see today. It was fairly socialist in the original proper sense. It was very much for free speech and free expression. In many ways, you might say it's diametrically opposed to the university radicalism we see today, which is trying to shut people up and stifle them, and is very much against sexual expression. So little wonder that the university radicals of today perhaps rankle at something that was birthed out of the university radicalism of then, though my own values are perhaps more in line with that historical context. Now, when he speaks of ideologies, I don't think that is correct. There's no explicit ideology in Dungeons & Dragons or most role-playing games. Rather, it's very much down to the games master and the players to negotiate what kind of game they want to play. Gygax made a few attempts to enforce a particular way or means of playing or a particular interpretation, but that never really got anywhere. Immediately people were house ruling their games, bringing in new things in a way that presaged the punk culture that was to come. And D&D was associated with subcultures and universities throughout. We only really saw a dent in that in the 90s and the first wave of political correctness. But even then, rather than attacking older games per se, apart from maybe a few sort of sidelong snarks here and there, people went about making their own games, and some of those were quite good, and despite being PC for the time, are still regarded as somewhat problematic today, games like Vampire and so on. But still, it's important to keep this historical and cultural context in mind moving forward. As a system for collaborative creation within a fantasy-focused virtual world, D&D is an analogue toolset for group production of cultural artifacts, narratives and expressions of agency. The rules of D&D function as constituents of culture, as they are artifacts that mediate group understanding and individual learning. In D&D, a group of players mutually construct and enact stories within a shared and pervasive virtual world. There's an emphasis on tactical combat, narrative development and spatial exploration. D&D illustrates powerful possibilities for socialization and learning. It also highlights key tropes in games, both digital and non-digital, that followed in its footsteps. From concepts of leveling up to hit points to classes of characters frequently chosen in online RPGs. D&D has shaped the landscape of games, learning and virtual world exploration. It is also largely influenced by the designer's mutual passion for wargaming and for fantasy and science fiction pulp stories. These influences were embedded into the assumptions of D&D's system mechanics, particularly considering that D&D has shaped formative learning experiences of myriad gaming enthusiasts over the past 40 years of existence, as well as its osmotic reflection in popular media, ranging from World of Warcraft to Game of Thrones, to its formative influence on acclaimed novelists like Junot Diaz and Ta-Nehisi Coates. This article takes a cultural historical perspective at how the systems that drive D&D's rules have shaped cultural understanding and learning within the game. I think the author misses one of the key and essential ingredients of D&D in that it has always been do-it-yourself. People have always modified and transmuted it. Indeed, other systems have spawned from that, and other approaches have spawned from the same rule set that are wildly different in play. Comparing Redbox D&D as it was originally with, say, Lamentations of the Flame Princess, you'll find the same rule set at the core driving everything, but massively different interpretations just by how it is played. This is like saying that English has a particularly massive influence on everyone. You might as well be saying that the English language has been a formative influence on acclaimed novelists, which it has because they communicate through it. But the point is that it's adaptable and you can communicate many different things, and you can alter the nature of games. You can make up new rules, to the point where a lot of times back in the day of AD&D 2nd edition, if you took your character from one table to the next, it might not be playable within that game because of the amount of house ruling that they'd done. To take D&D as being gospel in the way that this paper seems to is in no small part to entirely miss the point of D&D. And it also seems to self-contradict in taking it as that authoritative and directing force. It's missing the point, though it mentions it, of how D&D was influenced by literary endeavours. So it's a mutual feedback. It's another expression of fantasy and genre fiction. It's just one that people could do themselves, between themselves, with rules to determine who wins and who loses, but not necessarily what you could do. I mean, this is one of the key aspects of RPGs, that you can potentially do anything. With collaborative creation at the origin of D&D, as well as key to how players explore and construct meaning within the D&D system, the values and influences that are embedded within the game must be excavated. In particular, D&D's role in shaping a history of symbolic violence in gaming culture is a legacy that is acknowledged but not empirically interrogated. In the context that this study was enmeshed, the systems of play were embroiled in Gamergate, an online mob ostensibly about ethics in gaming journalism that primarily targeted women for harassment. By unpacking the embedded nature of inequality as related to games, gender and race, this study helps explore conceptions and enactment of power in games and in broader gaming culture. Ultimately, this study's emphasis on understanding the foundational depictions of race, gender and power in a non-digital gaming system highlights how cultural, historical approaches to understanding learning within systems must begin with an understanding of the implicit biases of these systems. Further, this article's emphasis on how culturally constructed gaming systems shape the meaning, making and experiences of their gaming communities speaks more broadly to the methodological challenges of studying systems and how they shape the communities around them. Well, there's a couple of elephants gallivanting around the room in this section, and red flags as to where it seems that he's going to be heading with this article. First, to address Gamergate. It was not ostensibly about ethics in gaming journalism, it very much was about ethics in gaming journalism, and as secondary aspects about censorship, and about the very kind of new wave moral panic around gender, race, social justice and so on that is embodied within this article. There are breakdowns that showed that Gamergate primarily targeted men, and besides, if women are the ones who are transgressing the ethical rules of a system, shouldn't they be held to the same account that men were? Anyway, if you really want to get into Gamergate and understand it and why this is completely wrong, I chronicle the social history of Gamergate in my book Inside Gamergate, which I suggest that you read. I won't waste much more time on that unless it comes up, or specific claims are made that need to be debunked. But yes, the FBI and the Women in Action Media reports both basically exonerated Gamergate of targeted harassment and so on. It was, however, useful that people could conflate trolls with Gamergate in order to blame Gamergate and call them all harassers. Anyway, moving on. The next elephant is the idea of implicit bias. Now, you've probably heard about this in terms of implicit bias training and so on, or online tests where you can see whether you have some kind of implicit bias towards a particular racial minority or whatever else. There's a whole raft of online tests that you can take. However, implicit bias is not very well supported by the science. Indeed, it has been contradicted by studies. It's unsafe grounds upon which to build any kind of conclusion, in short. Even if we're being absolutely generous, we can say that it is not proven, or it has problems. So we shouldn't take the idea of implicit bias seriously. Now, having looked at this, we can see where this is going. This is going to try and hang the blame for bad behaviour that in most cases didn't happen, but does happen in individual cases. And it's going to try and hang that blame on the cultural influence of role-playing games, or more widely the things that role-playing games have influenced, like modern board, card games, computer games, and so on. So it's going to try and form a link between media and behaviour. And we've seen all this before. We've seen it in claims of violence in video games making people violent in the Jack Thompson era, and heavy metal making people suicidal or turning them into Satanists, and that whole satanic panic thing took in D&D in the past then too. There are studies, I've been trying to track it down, but there is a particular study, which I haven't been able to re-find, some gaming historian might be able to help me out here, that showed that role-playing gamers, on average, had a better distinction between reality and fantasy than a normal control group, and were less suicidal than a normal control group, which just goes to show. And yet, still, in the 21st century, nearly 20 years into the 21st century, 40 years plus after D&D was invented, we still have people trying to conflate media and bad behaviour in the form of a moral panic, now with a thin veneer of academia rather than religion, but it often seems that there's very little difference. Anyway, let's see how he tries to establish these links. Gutierrez and Rogoff remind us that people live in culture in a mutually constitutive manner in which it is not fruitful to tote up their characteristics as if they occur independently of culture, and of culture as if it occurs independently of people. If people, as participants in D&D, mediate lives and experiences within the virtual world of the game, the ways this world is bound by culturally informed rule systems plays a significant role in shaping the experience and limitations on players' experiences. With this in mind, this study seeks to unpack the following questions. How are gender, race and power defined explicitly and implicitly within the rules systems of D&D? How do these constructions of gender, race and power reflect the influences on the gaming system? How do these constructions shape player experiences within D&D virtual worlds in both the past and present? Yet again, I think we have a failure to understand the nature of D&D. Dungeons & Dragons is not like a game of Monopoly with set pieces and absolutely set rules. It's much more mutable. It is much more like a game of Lego. If you think of each rule or each piece of background information and so on as bricks, you can perhaps understand better that these can be put together in innumerable shapes, innumerable configurations of the whole. And so pretty much every individual and every group playing D&D has a different experience, so it is really virtually impossible to pin down, outside of a few sacred cows of the system, any kind of hard ground upon which to sit yourself and talk about D&D as a cultural force. It is just too improvisational, too do-it-yourself, too punk in its aesthetic and systems for anyone to do this, and yet this is what he's going to try and do, and then, apparently, try and take that and say that it has impact in the real world. I don't think either of these assumptions are safe, or if they exist, they are very, very weak, and exist only in very rare individuals. As far as gender and so on in games, There were optional rules for differing stat maximums for men and women, which would reflect the real world if people wanted to bring that into their fantasy, something I've struggled with myself in my Korean RPG. To an extent, people playing these characters allot their stats differently according to what gender they're playing or to what gender the player is, but then you needn't play your own gender. So all of these assumptions are really things that rest upon the player, not the game. Race is trickier because really race in fantasy games is more like species. You know, there's more of a difference between an orc and a halfling than there is between a black person and a white person in the real world. You don't find things like +1 to dancing or, you know, a free level in rap or anything by race in these games. That would be stupid and that would be racist. The differentiation just simply doesn't show up, much to the chagrin of many race realists and white supremacists, I would expect. So we have a dubious link to a dubious link to a dubious link here. By understanding the embedded values of virtual worlds, this study explores how systems shape specific forms of play. In doing so, this study illustrates Cole, Gonku, and Vadeboncoeur's claim that cultural, historical, and activity theory are approaches that investigate the past as well as the present. Specifically, in looking at how a group of gaming creators 40 years ago continue to shape cultural meaning making in the present, I link systems of the past with their human authors and the biases they implicitly carry into their work. As Gould explained, systems are made by people and attract systems people. Again, this fails to understand that the system is mutable, that D&D is a toy more than a game in some ways. This idea, this claim that implicit bias, which as we've already covered is pretty dodgy, shapes these systems in such a way as they influence other people with these implicit biases. There's no real meat, there's no real weight to that. It's like claiming that mathematics is gendered, which is a claim that has been made by the ludicrous end of the postmodernists. This is part of that slippery slope that leads to people claiming that relativity is patriarchal because it privileges the speed of light over other speeds, or that we need chemistry or algebra or feminist biology or feminist fluid dynamics, or all these kind of outre weird claims that we find are rooted in this assumption. Now, it might be a bit more solid when it comes to cultural artifacts, but the cultural expression of role-playing games is somewhat, almost entirely in the case of some games, separated from its mechanical and its systems basis. Now, ideally, you want those two things to be working in synergy together so that the kind of stories that you want to tell with a particular game are supported by the rules, and people house rule or use different systems. And that's also worth pointing out. Oranges are not the only fruit, D&D is not the only role-playing game. Although this study confines its research to a singular, though changing over time, system of non-digital play, I enter this work to highlight how a cultural historical approach can reveal problematic biases and assumptions within systems at large, how social constructions of schooling, informal learning environments, and exploration in gaming communities are mediated by systems of the past reveals potentially problematic blind spots for researchers in these spaces. Well, I suppose we had to get the buzzword problematic in there at least a couple of times. Reading historically across all of the editions of D&D published over the last 40 years, 11 official D&D editions as well as an additional non-official version, this article tracks how the rules that guide the world's most popular role-playing game reinforce assumptions of race and gender within tabletop gaming communities. To be clear, although I cast a critical eye at constructions of masculinity and femininity as depicted within the game, I do so recognising that these constructions moved alongside, as well as reinforced, the temporal depictions of men and women in popular culture from the 1970s to the present. Clearly, particularly within a gaming system that rewards players' imaginations, there are exceptions and shifts towards equity and inclusivity within gaming communities. However, the base ideological assumptions of D&D highlight how gaming culture alone is not the sole influence on the experiences of women within gaming communities. These experiences have been cultivated from embedded assumptions within the rules of D&D. To illustrate this point, I specifically look at conceptions of race and gender within D&D based on the text written, images displayed, and the noted influences across the editions. Ultimately, I entered this work seeking to understand the assumptions of these gaming systems and the methodological implications such systems have on the study of virtual worlds, their cultures, and their communities of play. Here again, I think we see the red flags that we are used to as gamers of how people want to come in and alter what we do. Now, that may seem silly given that, as I've emphasized multiple times, people can turn the games into whatever they want. But that's also really an argument not to force the central game to be changed, and he does undermine his own point and his own future claims in that he acknowledges that the games change with the times, which suggests that they don't have a particularly reinforcing effect and that they do move with the social tides. In some cases, this might actually be unfortunate. Games make interesting historical artifacts in that they can reflect the ideas and so on of the time, particularly when it comes around people's fantasies. But then, again, we have to recognise that there is a divide between the real and the fantastical. All of us have fantasies of various things that we would never do in the real world, or that we can't do in the real world, and which games allow for. So there is very little, if any, transference between the fantastical and the real. But nobody escapes the Matrix. Section: Systems at Work. D&D, like other games, both digital and non-digital, is governed by a system of mechanics. The system of rules and constraints dictates what play means and how it is conducted. These complex systems at work both replicate and model lived experiences while separating play from normal, non-gaming activity. Arguably, whereas digital games adjudicate rules within the black box of computer code, human intuition, thinking, and interpretation supervise play in non-digital contexts, such as playing D&D around a table. In considering how systems are overseen by individuals, particularly in the context of non-digital gameplay, O'Connor, Peck, and Caffarella's examination of how students navigate institutions of higher education reminds us that systems are layered with computational rules, guidelines, and instructions, and yet humanity and subjectivity are always present. In particular, O'Connor et al.'s comment, originally within the context of exploring engineering students' course pathways, reminds researchers that culturally mediated spaces are constructed from the primordial soup of human knowledge and social biases. Despite the thousands of pages of rules or millions of lines of code in digital contexts, these are systems made by individuals and for individuals. And this is where the canonization, the lionization of subjectivity as being important comes around to bite you on the arse. Because just because your interpretation of a system is that it is racist, or sexist, or whatever other spin you put on it, by your own definition doesn't mean that it is, it's just your interpretation. And in fact, teaching people to interpret systems in this way may be creating a problem that objectively does not exist, or would not exist, without these negative interpretations constantly being spun towards whatever system you're talking about. So it's worth keeping in mind that the already tenuous links are undermined even if we use the person's own theoretical and academic context in which to examine D&D, or indeed anything else. If you examine something with the critical lens of feminism, you're going to introduce a subjective bias into how you interpret things. So this is very much self-defeating. Considering their creation by individuals, biases and inherent inequalities are both consciously and unconsciously embedded within systems. As argued in ongoing scholarship related to critical cyberculture, foundational questions of oppression and exclusion in online context must foreground how scholars explore and unpack meaning in online and virtual environments. For example, Daniels contends that internet-related research must acknowledge the presence of racism online, while simultaneously recognizing the deep roots of racial inequality in existing social structures that shape technoculture. Likewise, De La Pena traces a lineage of scholarship detailing how racial difference and whiteness are constructed through technology. Although the research in this article focuses on systems designed in the 1970s, not intended to connect to online networks, the critical emphasis on how inequalities, particularly around race and gender, are embedded in cultural systems remains vital. Contexts of gaming are, like the internet, embedded in material, corporeal lives in complex ways. This critical cyberculture research points to a further need for understanding the cultural and historical approaches to understanding non-digital gaming. The learning, meaning-making and cultural mediation that happens within contexts governed by the systems of rules, gaming, schooling and broader communities of practice. For example, require researchers to consider how the cultural historical repertoires embedded within these systems affect what is produced and understood in these spaces, rather than simply looking at how sexist practices or racial discrimination happen within and around online video game communities. This study suggests that these practices could be embedded within systems of play. This is really just a repetition of earlier points. The idea that the individuals who create the games have their own biases and so on, which they encode into the games, which then go on to influence others, which then go on to create communities which are hostile or exclusionary to other people. Now, I agree with not a single point on that chain of reasoning, or think that it's incredibly weak. But yes, this was really just a repeat. But the excessive verbosity and circumlocution of academic language is certainly beginning to wear on my not inestimable patience. Further, as previously noted, gaming systems create spaces for cultural production that are safely ensconced from the rest of the world. Huizenga describes this space as the magic circle, noting that play stands consciously outside ordinary life as being not serious, but at the same time absorbing the player utensil and utterly. Salen and Zimmerman elaborated on this concept, noting that this magic circle is a special place in time and space created by a game. As both part and beside traditional cultural norms, the magic circle inscribes a space that is culturally productive and built on the foundation of past production. Missing in most analysis of the magic circle is the interloper within the space, the gaming system itself. As products of the specific cultural and temporal locations in which they are produced, games carry with them their own ethics and values. As systems that dictate these values, games are social technologies. Like the technologies that mediate today's networked society, the social technologies of gaming do not remain static. Their systems are updated and iterated upon, such that they reflect changes in contemporary society's relationship with these games. D&D, for example, has gone through a dozen systemic editions that have refined, altered, or clarified what play within the system entails. In describing games as social technologies, Flanagan noted that games, functioning as an ordering logic, a machine, or a technology for creating social relations, work to distill or abstract the everyday actions of the players into easy-to-understand instruments where context is defamiliarized just enough to allow Huizenga's magic circle of play to manifest. I think it's worth comparing the gaming community to certain other small inward communities, these magic circles that he talks about. On the negative side, they can become similar to echo chambers, which are a huge problem on social media. Generally, it must be said, it's the social justice warrior types who tend to close themselves off to other people, to other people's criticisms and so on of their claims and their ideas. And this results in a slow slide towards extremism, something that's also seen within circles of cults, of religious extremists, and of terrorists, which often conflates with the previous two. So being completely closed off is not good, but there is something to be said for having a close-knit community. And it's often incredibly culturally productive. We can look at communes of artists or circles of writers and so on, many of whom mutually influenced one another and produced cultural artifacts of great significance. You could characterize gaming culture or the gaming group as a safe space in which someone can try out ideas, live out certain fantasies and so on within a negotiated space. Friendships that are formed within gaming circles are often very strong and are for life because there is a regularity of contact and an exchange of trust within that group. Little wonder in these kind of contexts then that interlopers, and I'm not talking about the system here, I'm talking about outsiders coming into this space and disrupting it, are often met with hostility. The opportunities for transgressive social play are limited only by the imagination of players and the constraints of what a gaming system will allow. How a game is designed carries implications for the social group playing it. However, although systems encourage iteration and systems change over time, the ideological assumptions underneath them largely do not. Considering that games as systems are foundationally built on human beliefs and ideas, concerns about who authors these games and with what blind spots is particularly worrisome. Aligned with Vosugi, Hooper and Escude's 2016 concern about cultural depictions of making, the need for interrogating what is recognised as making looks at the underpinnings of gaming systems as imperative. As cultural artefacts and social technologies, games are deeply embedded within the beliefs of the individuals who created them. Further, despite the limitations of who is characteristically playing and making games like D&D, the forms of learning within these systems can be robust. Once again, I fear we have another incidence of a failure to understand the Lego-like nature of role-playing systems, and that no two interpretations are going to be the same, or that people will house rule away things that they don't like. This approach to understanding D&D appears to be taking it as holy writ, as canon, and that's simply not how the game is played. The assumptions of your games master, the assumptions of your playing group, and the rules that they choose to play with are far more influential, overwhelmingly more influential. Section: Dungeons & Dragons as a System for Cultural Production. To contextualise this study's emphasis on tabletop role-playing and the broader gaming culture it falls within, I offer a brief history of D&D and acknowledge that lengthier histories of the game and its influence provide additional nuance. D&D, the first commercially released RPG, was first published in 1974 as 3 booklets, authored by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. As described in the first Player's Handbook, D&D is a fantasy game of role-playing which relies upon the imagination of participants. For it is certainly make-believe, yet it is so interesting, so challenging, so mind-unleashing that it comes near reality. Although D&D spawned many other games within the genre it established, it did not remain static. 3 years after its first release, D&D published 2 different updated versions of its rules system: Gygax's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and the Eric Holmes revised Basic Dungeons & Dragons. This gave players opportunities to extend the basic rule system and clarify the fundamentals of play for individuals new to the game. Following these releases, D&D's publishers would release newer editions of the game at irregular intervals to correct and update the system, as well as to shore up a bevy of sales of the newly released books. Regardless of which edition of the game is explored, the fundamentals of how to play D&D still revolve around the basic functions and beliefs of what adventure and storytelling look like. D&D as a system for collaborative storytelling is built around 3 primary modes of play and narrative development. As most clearly articulated in the 2014 release of the game's 5th edition, D&D's 3 pillars of adventure are exploration, social interaction, and combat. Like the assumptions D&D's designers situated about race and gender within the gaming system, the forms of play and the ideologies it established shifted from one edition to another. Again, I'm going to have to take issue with the idea that these games establish ideologies. Ideology has not really been a core component of any RPG up until perhaps the first wave of 90s ones that were political correctness influenced, or at least influenced by the overall feel of the time, the whole Generation X thing. Or until indie games in the late 90s through to 2000s, with the explosion of being able to sell games as PDFs and to do more experimental and small-scale productions. But even so, ideology has not really been truly explicit until recently, and it has not been reactionary or conservative ideologies that have been present in the games. To the extent that they do, that has been a reaction to intrusions by ideological interlopers. Many people within games do not want ideology to be present in their games. They would prefer, if they're going to include that in any way, to have that established at their table, or they see games as an escape from the increasingly polarized political intrusion into the rest of their life. Ironically, it is papers like this and attitudes like this that have made games ideological in a way that they never were before. Although the virtual worlds of D&D have been significantly expanded with optional books, spin-off novels and other gaming material, analysis in this article focuses on the how-to-play guides of the basic editions of D&D and the Player's Handbook for various editions of the game across its 40-year history. These are the texts that nearly every player purchases and reads in order to play D&D. Changes in ideology and representation are tracked in these foundational books. While this article follows the development of D&D across 40 years, one significant addition is included in the figure above, Pathfinder. With the release of the third edition of D&D, its publisher Wizards of the Coast encouraged third-party publishers and enthusiasts to legally publish and sell materials connected to the rule system of D&D. The Open Gaming License allowed for additions to and changes around the existing D&D rule set, with a large contingent of D&D players disappointed by the changes to be found in the 2008 4th edition of D&D. Paizo Publishing met this audience's needs by forging a new path for loyal D&D players. They released Pathfinder as a revised version of the 3.5 edition's rule set. For the years after 4th edition's release, Pathfinder was the most popular RPG being bought and played. Although not technically a D&D product and published by a different company, the Pathfinder system is seen within the contemporary history of tabletop RPGs as an extension of the D&D rule set. And even while D&D 5th edition is the top-selling RPG at the time that I write this, Pathfinder continues to support a large number of players of D&D. In the 40 years since its release, the influence that D&D has had on popular Western culture is profound, from influencing the designs of myriad video game titles and tropes, to shaping the experiences of the aforementioned literary superstars. D&D has seeped into multiple facets of culture, flowing along the same veins that course with inspiration from slaying dragons and liberating societies of mythical beings, are the designed depictions of women, race, and power within the D&D system. There's some interesting things to explore here in terms of Pathfinder and 4th edition D&D. 4th edition D&D was, in no small part, designed to try and compete directly with the computer games market. It became much more miniatures focused, powers became far more defined. It played a lot like World of Warcraft, only with miniatures and a lot slower. But this gutted all the things that gave D&D individuality and advantages over computer games, the raw creativity, the interpretation, the customizability and so on. Because the systems were so much more interlocked, it was much harder to customize. Some people enjoyed it, we played a campaign of it and managed to have fun, but by customizing it to a high degree. And in reaching out for this new market, this new broader market, D&D almost killed itself. And that gave the opportunity for Pathfinder to come in, and Pathfinder remained a much more traditional system, quite crunchy, building on the background of 3.5 D&D and the audience that had built up, and that was very much built more on the customizability and so on, and the open gaming system. So when they tried to put the genie back in the box with 4th edition, while at the same time trying to broaden their appeal to a new, younger computer literate audience, they failed, while Pathfinder succeeded massively. When it comes to the kind of social, gender and race issues that the author of the article talks about here, Pathfinder, Paizo, the company behind it, definitely tried to appease the people with these kind of demands. This annoyed a section of their fan base and still wasn't good enough for the people who were demanding these changes. So there's two sets of lessons to be learned there, which complement each other. Section, Methodology. Subsection, Context for study. In considering the gap between studying learning within games and the roots of cultural stereotypes and symbolic violence happening around games, this article is part of a larger study focusing on learning and language practices within tabletop gaming communities. In 2014, I embarked on ethnographic research of player communities of tabletop role-playing communities in northern Colorado. Over the course of 24 months, I participated in and socialized with myriad individuals engaged in public RPG communities. Following a lineage of ethnography within virtual world environments, my fieldwork in this space focused on the interactions between players both in-game and around the table, as well as how broader internet-driven networks of fandom shaped the localized experiences at my table. Recognizing that virtual worlds are inherently performative spaces, studying these games meant playing these games as well. While conducting research within the virtual worlds created in D&D and other systems, it became clear that the foundations on which these games were established shaped the context of identities in players and their actions within the worlds. Noting that the systems of play guided the kind of actions I observed in my data, this article's analysis of the existing depictions of race, gender and power within D&D uses Flanagan's frame of games as social technologies as a primary conceptual framework. Credit where it's due, he talked to gamers. It remains to be seen in this article whether he took what they were telling him to heart or whether he was just observing, or the ethics of it, whether he informed them that he was studying them, and so on. And I feel he should have talked to some designers as well. After all, you've got the person transmitting whatever message it is that they are supposedly transmitting or want to transmit. You have the medium through which it passes, in this case the game and its attendant materials, and then you have the message as received by the people at the other end and their interpretation. But he doesn't seem to have traced this whole arc. Subsection: Unarchiving Humanity within the D&D system. For this study I read and annotated the primary rulebooks for D&D for each of the 12 editions listed in Table 1, as well as the wargaming text Chainmail. That functioned as the mechanical rules for the 1974 release of the game. The primary rulebooks for D&D, starting with the 1977 Advanced Edition, are 3 books: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Taken together, these 3 books are the primary rules for how to play, and have been subsequently released as a trio for every edition of D&D since 1977. The 4 basic editions of D&D simplified all of the rules into a single boxed product. These texts have gotten longer over time, whereas the complete original version of D&D was a mere 110 folded pamphlet-sized pages. The most recent Player's Handbook is 316 pages in length. For Pathfinder, a single and hefty 575-page core rulebook combines the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide material. In total, I read and compared more than 5,500 pages of text across the versions of the game. This study's emphasis is on specific explanations of race, gender and power, and significantly limited the areas of cross-analysis within the books. After reading the texts, I looked at how issues of representation are addressed directly and indirectly, including gendered pronouns within the text and images of race and gender. As explained next, I specifically counted each individual represented within the pages of the book to quantify representation whenever possible. Counting pronouns is going to cause a problem in any analysis or reading of the text. After all, he is gender neutral, grammatically speaking. It's why you address a letter to an unknown recipient as Dear Sir. It's why we talk about mankind. Linguistically, there used to be 2 kinds of differentiation. Man, for example, was prefixed in Old English with where or with, depending whether you were talking about a man or a woman. So when you were talking about humans, you would say men. If you were talking about a man, you would say where man. If you were talking about a woman, you would say woofman, and so forth. So, looking back at older editions, basically anything prior to the 90s, when people started using female pronouns as a default, or using they, is going to create an impression that isn't contextual to the history. The idea of using feminine or they pronouns, like I said, really only came in the 90s, and even then was at the kind of extreme end. It happens more often now, but it's still far from universal, and it's still not grammatically correct. A note before moving forward with the analysis in this article. Undeniably, both gender and race are complex, particularly in the context of this study's emphasis on gaming culture's complicated and stifling relationship with feminist critique and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer participants. I recognise that gender is not a binary construction, and the analysis that follows does not argue as such. Likewise, although I do examine the images of individuals as depicted across editions of D&D, I do not believe that one's gender identity can be interpreted solely based on its depiction in pictures. However, considering the often egregious depictions of scantily clad women adorning the covers of fantasy and science fiction texts that both inspire and have been inspired by D&D, the male gaze guides cultural distinctions of feminine performance within the virtual worlds of play. As such, the analysis that follows explores how these images reinforce what being female looks like within D&D. In the cases of images that are ambiguously gendered by artists and that do not have captions to clarify, I have given the books the benefit of the doubt and added these images as inclusive of representing females. As a result, the figures that follow may be slightly skewed to include more female representation than was intended within the pages of the books. There's several things missing from this outline of how he's going to go about analysing things. There is the fact that women's fantasies often correspond with men's families. If you look at men's magazines, you will find depictions of beautiful women that men are attracted to. If you look at women's magazines, you will often find depictions of beautiful women who women want to be. Fantasies often correspond to one another, so what is assumed to be the male gaze may not be the male gaze, though it probably is in certainly the earlier context of D&D, bearing in mind that the overwhelming majority of the audience was male, this despite the games having been first tried out on Gygax's daughter, amongst other women who were involved at the very dawn of D&D. The idea that fantasies can be problematic is itself problematic. Women often have problematic fantasies. Rape fantasies, for example, are extremely common, yet this does not mean that someone wants to bring that into the real world in any way. To suggest that it is to misunderstand the very nature of fantasy in the first place. There's also nothing, I think, inherently wrong with a particular form of entertainment being tailored towards one gender or the other. There are things that appeal more to women, there are things that appeal more to men. Those things move to meet their audience, and again, the audience for D&D has been, and remains, primarily and overwhelmingly male, and so it only makes sense from a commercial and a creative perspective to cater to your primary audience while making allowances perhaps for minority audiences. We can see illustrated in D&D's history how abandoning your core audience to try and reach for a new audience can be disastrous, as happened with D&D 4th edition. And that was an apolitical instance of that causing problems, but we can see that other places. Section: Findings. Subsection: Gender construction and representation in D&D. Whether in basements, friends' living rooms, or the early gaming conventions organised by Gygax and friends, D&D was developed out of the wargaming communities, comprised largely of white men, their complex rule systems, and their toys. By the time the first rulebook of D&D was released, the male-dominated genre, despite the game being playtested by Gygax's daughter, erased female players from within the purview of the book. The first of the 3 books in the original D&D release was called Men and Magic. Likewise, the actual text refers to players using only the male pronouns, beginning with the section labelled Preparation for the Campaign. The referee bears the entire burden here, but if care and thought are used, the reward will more than repay him. Reinforcing the invisibility of female players within the rules of D&D, the 3 types of characters that players could choose were fighting men, magic users, and clerics. Further, though there are distinctions between humans and other fantasy races like dwarves and elves, The rules distinctly note the options for men in terms of class features and the alignment they can choose, i.e. the moral code the character follows. As the instantiation of rules they developed among male friends, Arneson Gygax's original rules reflect an absence of women. I already noted the grammatical issues around this, particularly historically, that this is correct English and was correct English, and the alternatives were less accepted at the time, particularly by editors. So a lot of this concern is unwarranted. Further, I think it's important to note the influence of Tolkien. Tolkien talks about the race of men, he talks about the strength of men and so on, even though he has at least one fairly strong female protagonist within his book. Similarly here, there is this differentiation between races, and they're talking about the race of men in a Tolkien-esque fashion, which was replaced later by human, but the fantasy influences are more worn on the sleeve here. By the time the first advanced D&D rules were released 4 years later, women were acknowledged, but in limited and troubling ways. In the foreword to the first Player's Handbook, Mike Carr wrote that D&D players happily come in all shapes and sizes, and even a fair number of women are counted amongst those who regularly play the game, making Dungeons & Dragons somewhat special in this regard. With the third sentence of the book, Carr attempts to draw women into the gaming genre, though the even exceptionalizes and exoticizes female players around a largely male-dominated space. Further, the 1978 edition of D&D carries on the tradition of utilizing male pronouns, but explains this decision. Although the masculine form of appellation is typically used when listing the level titles of the various types of characters, these names can easily be changed to the feminine if desired. This is fantasy. What's in a name? In all but few cases, sex makes no difference to ability. This is possibly the first incidence of can't win, don't try to be noted within the role-playing design community. Someone celebrates the fact that there are women, makes accommodation for them, and yet the author of this paper here in 2018 dismisses this and says that it is in fact making things worse. It is interesting that role-playing games have had, since quite early, have had a significant minority of female players. In my experience, and some people may read this as problematic, this is because role-playing introduces narrative and character elements of story, that female players on aggregate tend to engage with more. And this is given equal standing to the kind of statistical number crunching and tactics and so on that one finds in combat in games. War games have never managed to get as much traction with female players as role-playing games have, and this is really the chief difference. One of the places where the choice of a character's sex does make a difference is in physical ability. As demonstrated in a table depicting the maximum strength for characters, females have lower strength than males. In a system where you can be an elf, cast powerful spells, and barter with dragons, the notion that women could be as strong, if not stronger than men, was too preposterous to be developed within the system. This shift is striking because Gygax had to intentionally develop a system that diminished the power of women within the game. This was a system that was developed within the revision of the game, with several years to develop this iteration of the system. Although these strength restrictions were removed in later editions, the ever-expanding complexity of the game meant that player characters were given a chart to consider the height and weight of the characters that they played. As the text helpfully explains, females tend to be lighter and shorter than males, thus the base numbers for height and weight are divided into male/female values. 15 years after the game's inception, an important change in the second edition only exacerbated how pronouns were acknowledged. Addressing the use of male pronouns, Cook wrote, "The male pronoun, he, him, his, is used exclusively throughout the AD&D game rules. We hope this won't be construed by anyone to be an attempt to exclude females from the game or imply their exclusion. Centuries of use have neutered the male pronoun. In written material it is clear, concise, and familiar. Nothing else is." I believe I've covered the pronoun thing enough, and he has failed yet again to consider the pronoun issue in its proper historical context. But referring to the statistical differences between men and women, starting with strength scores and so on, there are undeniable biological differences in the way the bell curves exist for men and women when it comes to physical strength and many other attributes. This is just a fact. Now, D&D didn't used to incorporate this because the differences weren't considered to be important, or because it was left up to players to be how they wanted to be. You could be an exceptionally strong woman if you wanted to. In my experience, male and female players tend to prioritise different statistics, and it would be interesting to do a study on that with assigned numbers for different character classes and see how they came out. But this rule was brought in because a certain faction of players are very much into all their statistics, and they want their game to more closely model reality. D&D isn't a particularly good system for doing this. There are other systems that are perhaps more useful for doing so, but there was an appeal, there was a desire for this within the gaming community to be more simulationist. And so these entirely optional rules were laid out as a way to account for that. And as for height and weight, this is another empirical fact in the real world, and again something that appeals to the simulationists. There's no reason you can't transgress those rules within the game, within your campaign, or be an outlier when it comes to height, weight, or whatever else. There is, however, a problem with this idea that just because there are talking dragons within your setting, that this means anything else goes completely. It's a paradox within fantastical fiction and so on, that the more fantastical elements that you introduce, the more relatable, the more familiar other elements have to be. If you look at Game of Thrones, it works so well because the fantastical elements are grounded within a really believable and historically centered view of society and of relations between men and women and between races and kingdoms and so on. That's why it works, because the things that you need to be believable are believable and resonate with history, and the things that are unbelievable also relate to that. The believability, the plausibility carries over. Explanations about pronouns would cease with later editions of D&D, starting with the third. When Pathfinder was published in 2009, the core rulebook and the books that followed its publication focused on 11 iconic characters. Every time a fighter is shown in Pathfinder's product, it's always the same fighter, Valeros. This decision made depicting characters easy to recognise and created engaging transmedia narratives for Pathfinder players to follow from one text to another. More important, of the 11 initial core iconic characters in Pathfinder, 6 are female and are described with female pronouns. Notably, additional official Pathfinder books highlighted that several of their iconic characters identify as part of the LGBTQ community, including the shaman Chandra, Pathfinder's first transgender iconic character. As previously noted, this did not manage to keep the activist wolves from Pathfinder's door. They still came in. And it's also worth pausing to note that there is an uneven number of characters, and the majority are female rather than an equal number of each, though now they've suggested that one is transgender. Whether you count that as non-binary or whatever, I don't know. I'm not that familiar with Pathfinder. But it does appear that there is a certain amount of bias creeping in, and there is an unrepresentative amount of representation going on. I don't think that's bad or good. Studies confirm that representation isn't generally that important to the vast and overwhelming majority of players of any race, gender, sexual proclivity, or otherwise. At least when it comes to computer games, there aren't role-playing specific studies. Subsection: Picturing women in D&D. The shifts in the D&D rules over 4 decades highlight efforts from the games designers to better acknowledge and bring in female players. This is despite the roots of toxic pathologies traced in the representation of the female body in D&D. Table 2 shows the number of images within the D&D core rulebooks that represent human and human-like, i.e. elves, dwarves, etc., characters. Within these images, I counted the total number of characters represented and the number of women within these. For example, if a photo illustrates a brawl with 6 figures and one of these individuals appears female, it is counted as a picture that includes women, but also adds only 1 female to the total number of individuals represented in the book. A picture can both increase the percentage of figures featuring women and decrease the percentage of total women represented in the book. The numbers in this table then highlight both the percentage of pictures that include women and the total number of women within the book compared to men. A few important considerations regarding this chart. The 1974 edition of D&D appears to have substantially higher a number of women than some of the editions that immediately followed it. Only the 1981 and 1983 editions have higher percentages, until the 2000 release of the 3rd edition. However, this is because there were so few pictures within the book in the first place. Further, of the 4 figures, including women in this book, 3 of these characters are witches, 1 is a Medusa, and 1 is a topless exotic Amazon. Just because the women are represented within this edition does not mean that they are represented powerfully. Similarly, in the 1st and 2nd editions of the game, those editions that specifically utilised the male pronoun throughout, although there were some women in the book, these images were frequently of women in scantily clad, sexualised attire, or women in diminutive and powerless positions. For example, a somewhat typical image from the game's 2nd edition shows a boy and girl cowering from a terror in the sky. In looking at the percentages in Table 2, it appears that women are more prominently featured in the basic editions of D&D. With substantially simplified rules and limited options, these basic editions were useful beginning sources for players new to the mechanics of RPGs. In seeing a representation gap between the basic and advanced versions of D&D, the publishers implicitly invite the question, which is discussed next: which games and which versions of these games are for whom? I have several concerns here. I think the author's bias is made apparent by the fact that they took an image of a young boy and girl both cowering from something terrifying as being a negative depiction of the girl. That really speaks to the bias with which they've interpreted everything else and calls everything else into question. The idea that you should have absolutely equal representation is also an issue. It suggests an exercise in quota filling and so forth. It also tends to ignore the value and power of tropes as they relate to stories. Now, when you imagine a tavern brawl, who do you imagine the protagonists or antagonists being? Probably chiefly men, with maybe an alewife or a waitress cowering or hiding. Primarily you're going to see men. And if you came across an illustration where it was exactly half and half, it would probably seem slightly off, wouldn't it? It might throw you out of the plausible immersion in what you're viewing. The idea of quotas, the idea of forcing the expression and incorporation of any subgroup, worries me from a creative perspective. I want people to be free to depict things how they wish. I don't want moral busybodies imposing quotas or telling people what they should or must be drawing. Perhaps following in the path forged by Pathfinder, the 5th edition significantly increases the number of images of women, and qualitatively, the women within the book are not as sexualized or placed in positions of terror as in previous editions. As these findings shift from looking at constructions of gender in D&D towards considering what race means within the rules, it is necessary to pause and consider that nearly all of the heroic characters, regardless of gender, are depicted as thin and able-bodied within the player's handbooks of the various editions. Although these texts have moved to include a closer balance of participants, they have also done so while largely casting images around traditional Western notions of beauty. In large part, as noted next, this primarily includes privileging whiteness as well. It's interesting to me that they equate nakedness or sexual depiction as somehow being bad or powerless. It has long frustrated me that violence has such a high representation in games, but sexuality does not. So to see this complaint feels rather bizarre. Again, you have to consider the audience, which for much of D&D's existence was teenage young adult men. Do they want to see depictions of scantily clad women? Yes. Should we cater to them? Probably. And again, these ideals of beauty and so on, these are things that men are attracted to and women want to be. We see this in contemporary culture, whatever you happen to think of that fact. But nakedness, going back, he talked about the Amazon being bare-breasted. Well, that's how they're supposedly described. Nakedness is not necessarily a sign of weakness or even sexualization. The artistic nude is something we can all say exists. The Celts used to go into battle skyclad, naked. Their women would often bare their breasts in battle, and it would often horrify and terrify perhaps more civilized opponents. There's just a failure constantly to understand the full context and to assume that the person with these particular biases, such as the ones the author has, that these ideas, these values are shared by everyone and everyone sees the same thing when they look. Subsection: Race and being partially human in D&D. Race, racism, and the cultural lessons that D&D teaches about innate feelings of distrust for individuals different from oneself are complicated. Fundamentally, race in D&D does not mean what it typically means in educational research. Instead, the races of D&D are largely a binary of human or demi-human. The human-like characters that players can don within the game since its first release. Players could become elves, dwarves, and halflings. Over the additions to the game, these options expanded to include other fantasy races such as gnomes and half-orcs. Although the rulebooks state that humans are the most common race found within the default world of D&D, there are many racial choices that players can make. Diversity breeds choice within the D&D system. In the basic editions of D&D, race was simplified. Players could choose to be either human with class options like magic user, fighter, etc., or a non-human character like an elf or dwarf. Most D&D characters are humans. A human can be a cleric, fighter, magic user, or thief. Humans are the most widespread of all intelligent beings. A character may also be a non-human, a dwarf, elf, or halfling. Each of these classes is also a separate race of beings. They are all commonly known as demi-humans, because they seem to be partially human. These basic categories of the game suggest a genetic determinism of what individuals can be and their capacity to excel at various aspects of D&D gameplay. Extending this work to the advanced versions of the game in creating a character within D&D, one of the first choices a player makes is the character's race. The decision affects mechanics and, in the earlier editions of the game, limits who and what an individual can become. Certain races are limited in how far they can advance within the game. In the second edition, for example, when looking at the cleric class, gnomes are restricted to reaching only the 9th level, halflings 8th, and elves 15th. Humans are unlimited in their potential. Perhaps a utopian perspective of human exceptionalism, these limitations fundamentally highlight implicit assumptions about racial inferiority within the game. Adding to these perspectives of some races being better than others, all the rulebooks have highlighted how different races interact and view one another. In this first player's handbook, Gygax noted that there are also certain likes and dislikes which must be considered in selecting a racial type for your character. The dealings which a character has with different races will be affected by racial preferences to some extent. Similarly, the acquisition of hirelings by racial type might prove difficult for some characters if they go outside a narrow field. Your Dungeon Master will certainly take racial preferences into account during interaction between your character and the various races which he or she will encounter. Racism is built into the D&D system. Early adventures, such as Slave Pits of the Undercity, focus on players freeing slaves and fighting oppressive forces. Although these adventures are set in a fictitious realm, racial differences drive evil intent and spark a tautology of who is inherently good or evil. One would think that tackling important and difficult issues such as race relations within games, as has happened, as he points out, since early editions, would be something that would make people like the author happy. Interrogating and examining these kinds of issues surely is a good thing. And in games it happens in the abstract and in the safe space of the game. You could play a racist and try and understand and live within their shoes. You could try to overcome it. And yet, this seems to be yet another source of criticism for them. I mean, as pointed out, races in these games are more often species, and these have become far more general and adaptable. But the strength of humanity, which is otherwise deeply average in most systems, has always been their adaptability. If you want to specialise in a particular thing, you might take a particular race whose strengths complement that particular type of character that you want to play. There's a lot being read into the text here that simply isn't there. When it comes to good and evil, in the real world, these are broadly subjective things. In the world of D&D, however, the cosmology is rather set. There is an objective good, there is an objective evil, and at least in earlier editions, though this has changed to a degree over time, there are races of creatures that are inherently and innately evil. Orcs, for example. Now this influence, as well as the racial distrust between elves and dwarves, is drawn very much from Tolkien. And if you don't understand that reference or the cosmology of Tolkien's world, then you're going to miss that, as the author appears to have done. Across the editions of the game, race has meant a series of mechanical augmentations to a character and preset attitudinal beliefs about other races within the world. These are fixed assumptions about distinct races built into the ideology of the gaming system. Even in the most recent version of the game, textual descriptions of races hint at bigotry and oppression within the game's history for different races. Half-orcs, for example, are described as having powerful savage attacks that provide opportunities for extra damage in certain situations. However, in playing such a character, participants also acknowledge that half-orcs have been largely despised by others. Grudging acceptance. Each half-orc finds a way to gain acceptance from those who hate orcs. Some are reserved, trying not to draw attention to themselves. A few demonstrate piety and good-heartedness as publicly as they can, whether or not such demonstrations are genuine. Some simply try to be so thought of that others just avoid them. Histories of war, slavery and rape and pillage are implied within this text about grudging acceptance. Although such text does not dictate if a character is good or evil, it implies the values and beliefs that the world within this system imposes on individuals, and what individuals impose on one another. Again, it cannot help but to feel odd that there is this objection to the exploration of these issues, which clearly the author is interested in, within the games, and the game provides a way of exploring race and bias and so on, if you so choose. I mean, remember, all of these rules, all of these attitudes, everything within is entirely optional and may not be present in the world at the table. But in creating a world, in presenting a world, core materials, canonical materials, tell you what the situation is within that world, and then you make your choices and play your character within that context. So all it's saying is that in this fictional world there is bias against this particular species or subspecies of humanoid available to player characters. I can't see anything wrong there. There's no reason to think this is a bad thing, and indeed it can allow you to explore these kinds of things. The X-Men in comics is an allegory for racism in the United States, and this was a good thing. This is a good thing, a way to explore it in a more abstracted sense, and these aspects in these games are the same. But what about race as we know it in today's real world? Even acknowledging that there are not cultural and ethnic differences among humans, let alone other fantasy races within the game, does not show up until the later editions of the game. Prior to the 5th edition, most humans and demi-human images are white heroic characters, building off the campaign setting of the Forgotten Realms. The 5th edition Player's Handbook explains, the material culture and physical characteristics of humans can change wildly from region to region. It continues. In the Forgotten Realms, 9 human ethnic groups are widely recognised, though over a dozen others are found in more localised areas of Faerun. These groups and the typical names of their members can be used as inspiration no matter which world your human is in. Detailing these different cultural groups, the book describes common physical traits such as different hair, eyes and skin tones, alongside culture differences and beliefs. Similarly, though this study's focus emphasises articulations of race and gender within the core rulebooks for the various editions of D&D, this study must also acknowledge the plethora of additional books and print-based materials that expand the cultural and racial options for D&D players. As early as the 1975 Blackmore supplement to the 1974 edition of D&D, players have built off cultural tropes of action films by introducing the monk class, martial artists largely inspired by kung fu films of the era. This class was expanded by the 1985 book Oriental Adventures. As the foreword to this volume makes clear, Oriental Adventures was developed from a white Occidental gaze. This new book is aimed at providing players and dungeon masters with the material they need to develop the other half of their fantasy world. Trammell noted that the success of Oriental Adventures could be inferred as based on the desires of a racist and sexist culture of American, Canadian and British gamers. Similarly, the opportunity to play the other half was provided with the 1992 release of Al-Qadim, a Middle Eastern expansion for the game inspired by the Western versions of 1001 Nights. The game's ongoing depiction and enchantment with exoticized non-Western cultures shaped the foundations of D&D. Race is usually a physical concept that extends beyond simply endowing cultural identities of human beings. However, it also usually reinforces Western notions of whiteness and ongoing fears of xenophobia. As both physical and cultural concepts within D&D, race and gender depictions are not defined solely by the game's author. Instead, the players extend and build from the tools of narrative construction they are provided in order to collaboratively extend problematic representations embedded within this system. When these fantasy worlds are presented, they often draw on things in the real world, and again, it's really hard to understand why they would object to these kind of representations, because on the one hand they're often objecting that these games aren't political or whatever, and then when you do include those elements you also get complaints. There is simply no way to please this particular audience. There is no way to win in this struggle of representation and politicization. There's just no way to do it. And there's an assumption here which I take great issue with. In complaining that games like, game settings rather, like Al-Qadim or Oriental Adventures are Western in gaze, he fails to take into account that the media upon which they are drawn is very often native to that arena. When we look at the monk, or we look at martial arts films, ninja films and so forth, those are produced within Japanese or Chinese culture. They were then exported to the West, badly dubbed, which is part of their charm sometimes, and that is what inspired those supplements. So it's not really a white Western view on these cultures, but these own cultures' view upon their past through the medium of action films, or in the case of Al-Qadim, 1001 Arabian Nights, or poems and stories that have been passed down, Sinbad and so forth. But what they're missing is that this also applies to our own past. The pseudo-medieval world of D&D is about as close to medieval history as the anime Ninja Scroll is to the feudal era of Japan. We treat our own past in exactly the same way that we treat other cultures and their historical and mythological narratives. This was particularly brought into sharp focus recently with Far Cry 5. Previous Far Cry games have had complaints about cultural appropriation and imperialism and so on. Perhaps partly in response to this, they brought Far Cry 5 to the United States, to flyover country, and yet treated it in exactly the same way that they had treated other cultures in other Far Cry games. And this caused outrage by the very same people that had complained about the previous games. there's no way to win. Subsection: Dungeon Masters and the Dynamics of Play and Power. Gender and race are constructed through the narratives that players choose to tell within the game, choosing to be, within the virtual world of the D&D system, a male or female character, a dwarf or a human. These are choices that hinge on players' decisions. They do, as just demonstrated, result in mechanical effects designed into the D&D rules system. However, unlike these player-facing choices, constructions of player power and agency are beyond the choices individuals make at the table. The actual rules of D&D dictate specific repertoires of cultural practice. As D&D and many RPGs that followed it is a collaborative storytelling game, the individual who facilitates and guides the stories being told is called the Dungeon Master. Elsewhere, I have written about how teachers can adopt the flexible practices of a DM in order to enrich their classroom learning environments. However, in the original descriptions of DMs, this was a role that was much more prescriptive and punitive in its relationship with players than what is described in the contemporary editions of D&D. The original editions of D&D refer to the DM as a referee and can be inferred as a rules interpreter. As Peterson noted, the role of the referee was seen as an arbiter of rules and permissibility within the wargaming circles from which D&D was created. Unlike the collaborative nature of how D&D is described and understood today, the game was originally one in which DMs created and governed a virtual world, and players were tasked as organisers and adventurers in order to explore it. Players are guided to cooperate with the Dungeon Master and respect his decisions, be prepared to accept his decision as final, and remember that not everything in the game will always go your way. Further, earlier editions included additional rules of how players must conduct themselves with the DM. For example, some editions of the game called for mappers and callers. The mapper is the player who draws a map of the dungeon as it is explored. One or more of the characters should be making maps, but one of the players must make the actual map. The caller is a player selected by the other players to describe part actions so the DM doesn't have to listen to several voices at once. Whereas all the editions of D&D corroborate the fact that the DM is the creative force behind a D&D game, the earlier versions of the game mechanically reinforced subservience to this individual. Likewise, the DM often kept information hidden from his or her players. The books of monsters, like the Fiend Folio, include the various creatures dwelling in the dungeons that players would encounter. To shield the content of the books and notes from players, as well as to occlude the die rolls they made, DMs often place a physical barrier or screen between themselves and the players at the table. Likewise, the Dungeon Master's Guide reinforces this aura of secrecy, suggesting that DMs must view any non-DM player possessing it as something less than worthy of honourable death. Again, like the conceptions of gender, the severity of description of this role has diminished across the various editions of D&D. DM screens are still commonly used in gaming communities, and current Dungeon Master's Guide and other DM-related material reinforce how DMs manage players. Issues of player control and enthusiasm are common within these texts. It's hard to see how any of this is a problem unless a particular Dungeon Master is a prick, or a particular player is a prick. Someone needs to be the final arbiter of what happens at the table, and this occurs by mutually agreed assignation of who is the GM. People may back each other up over certain decisions, but even going right back to the beginning, the Gygaxian interpretation of the GM as absolute dictator was never really in play, possibly outside of Gygax's group and a handful of others. It's always been a social negotiation between the players and the games master, but at the end of the day, someone has to say yes or no and interpret the rules and be in charge, and it's hard to see where there's a problem there. I mean, part of the appeal of D&D and other role-playing games is that it arbitrates imaginative play. Without it, you get into pew pew, you're dead, no, I've got a force field sort of levels of argument. You need someone to step in and determine whether the pew pew or the force field wins out. Subsection: Discussion: Studying within and around cultural systems. Although the findings in this study can be read as damning of a potentially sexist and racist history of a system that has shaped large swathes of contemporary geek culture, it is also a promising reminder that, like people, cultural constructions and systems change. In looking at the description of role-playing gamers in Gary Allen Fine's formative ethnography of these communities in the late 70s and 80s, his analysis rightly describes the fact that the vast majority of players at the time were male wargaming enthusiasts. However, Fine's assumptions about gender at the time although fitting in line with depictions of gender in the 1974, 1977 and 1989 editions of D&D, are out of step with the contemporary instantiations of D&D, e.g. women as female characters have little importance, male players comment that female characters should be treated as property and not as human beings. The systems of D&D, Pathfinder and their players are starkly different today. Further, the depictions of gender and race in the D&D system are not invented whole cloth by Gygax and Arneson. As detailed in numerous accounts, D&D was influenced by the tropes of wargaming tabletop games, as well as by the pulp narratives of writers like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. Assumptions of race and gender then can be traced further back to the lineage of cultural production of a group of male writers publishing near the turn of the 20th century. Gygax listed the authors who inspired his game design in the appendix of the 1979 edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Unsurprisingly, the 30 authors listed are all white, and only 3, Leigh Brackett, Andre Norton and Margaret St. Clair, are women. Tracing the Matryoshka doll-like nesting of cultural influences in production, it is important for researchers in systems-driven environments to consider how culture constructs identities. Although there is an abundance of insightful research into how games shape socialization and learning in both digital and non-digital contexts, such analyses cannot be studied as if games are isolated from the cultures that influence them, or in which they are embedded. This study's findings reveal 2 methodological stances to consider when looking at communities of gaming, schooling, and myriad other learning contexts. 1. The cultural production and influence around a community must be explored. How individuals understand what happens within a gaming community, for example, is shaped and influenced by cultural factors external to the ecosystem being analysed. In short, games are a part of culture, and culture seeps into their enactment. 2. The cultural production and influence from within the systemic design of cultural artifacts must be explored. As illustrated in this study, the human biases and beliefs of individuals that construct systems are embedded within systems. These guide beliefs and influence specific cultural historical repertoires. Yet again, I feel there is a failure to truly understand the context and so on of these influences upon the game. And so forth. Many of these writers that are referenced were progressive within their time, and judging them by the standards of today is absurd. Culture is changing ever more rapidly, so this cycle where it becomes absurd to judge the culture of the past by the standards of today, that is constantly shortening to the point where things that were wildly progressive not so long ago are now considered problematic. Again, also we see this attempt to try and draw some kind of link between the assumed biases of authors and that these have an influence on those who receive the communication. And there simply is no support for this assumption. Although cultural historical analyses often attend to the preceding first point, the human-built foundations within systems may more easily be overlooked, particularly as educational research considers biases, oppression, and equity in varied communities of practice. The role that cultural artifacts play in the shaping of meaning and understanding must be unpacked. In exploring tribalism in the online virtual world of World of Warcraft, Bergnall argued that stereotypes and cultural identities follow players into the game. Although the culture around online gaming reinforces Bergnall's claim, it is also worth recognising that stereotypes and prejudices don't just flow into games, they are pushed out through systems designs. From a cultural historical perspective, we must consider that identity is created from narratives that are floating around. Finally, in looking at how human biases shape systems, which in turn shape players' experiences, the purposes of these systems must be reiterated. As a tool for creative, collaborative, and ideally fun storytelling and play, D&D's system must both guide and provide liberating opportunities for innovation. Particularly considering that the non-canonical edition of D&D, Pathfinder, seems to play a significant role in shifting embedded representations of gender, this appears to be a significant moment to explore the possibilities of player communities extending and reshaping systems. Further research is needed on how player communities are redefining what games like D&D are for and what representation and identity in such games now looks like, acknowledging that game design means creating rules for others to play within and around. Pierce and Artemisia questioned How do you design for meaningful play when the play itself is unpredictable, essentially out of your control? The social fiction of virtual worlds can thus be viewed as a confluence of imagination, that of the designer and that of the players. D&D is a system of possibilities, although these possibilities have been constricted in initial iterations. The possibilities for revision, dialogue and production have proven ripe in opening up and diversifying what gaming and roleplay mean, and for whom. A critical understanding of how the foundational aspects of the system have shaped current forms of play only further enriches these contexts. Yet again here we see the assumptions of the author on show, and a failure to properly contextualize or to even understand how these games work, that they are Lego rather than a bicycle or whatever else. You get my point. They're customizable, endlessly customizable, and there are more games than D&D. The electronic publishing revolution has meant anybody can put out a game addressing any subject via any means and any mechanics and even different social interactions, even without a games master. It's wide open, and yet you still have people like this standing in judgment over someone else's creation and demanding that they change and shift it. And that is what prompts people to push and fight back against this sort of thing. The intrusiveness of it. Again, there's an irony in that the author is claiming that all of these things are coming into the game and influencing it and then flowing out and influencing other people. And yet his kind of interference, his kind of bringing politics into the games, bringing this kind of pseudo-intellectual critical analysis into gaming, is the very thing that people are objecting to, this interloper. Although our constantly changing cultural interactions with systems like D&D create opportunities for these systems to change and improve over time, the flurry of death threats and harassment from the Gamergate movement that gaming critic Anita Sarkeesian received highlights the ongoing vigilance needed around these systems. Sarkeesian's experiences reflect an additional layer of cultural mediation that is problematically occurring over time. In particular, this study should remind us that individuals' agency can function as a positive disruption to the stereotypes built into systems. Although the initial language and images of D&D mean it is unsurprising that popular media, from the Netflix hit Stranger Things to the television series Freaks and Geeks, largely depicts primarily white male characters reenacting nostalgic sessions, rolling dice with friends in the 1970s and 80s, this is a landscape that can change. By focusing on what happens within and around systems of cultural interaction, the possibilities for redefining systems and their communities become clearer. Like video games, the changes in language, design and political orientation in D&D occur only with the occasional release of new editions of the gaming systems. It is a process that is arrested in its development and perhaps has taken an inordinate amount of time to move beyond problematic representations of race and gender. And then he gives his acknowledgements and references. Ye gods, that was a fucking marathon, and well done if you're still with me. Now, he comes back to Gamergate at the end there, and Sarkeesian, but fails to properly place it in historical context. Role-playing games have always been ahead of the curve when it comes to equality and depiction and all of these other things, right back to the early editions. It's just looking back, they can seem a little clunky and outdated, particularly to someone who is looking at them through the biased lens that the author is. But they've always been welcoming, they've always wanted more people to play, but they haven't wanted to alter and change the game, the thing that they enjoy. And who can blame them? When you find something that you really, really enjoy, you don't want to place it at risk. When it comes to Sarkeesian, we have to understand that gaming has long been under attack. Initially, this was from people like the moral majority, the conservative evangelicals. There were book burnings. It was decried as being satanic and having a bad influence on people. And this was countered by studies that showed that it did not. This bleeds into the video games arena. which Sarkeesian is involved in, when it comes to Jack Thompson. This time around it was the idea that games were murder simulators that desensitized kids and made them more likely to be violent. We've seen that come up again recently around school shootings, but yet again there is no evidence that this is true whatsoever. So you have a community that has been attacked in such ways for a very long time, that being attacked in this way and resisting it has become a very strong part of their identity. Here comes someone else making a very similar claim. These games are dangerous, they make people sexist, racist, whatever else it might be. And of course, they strenuously resist it. And amongst that number of people resisting it are a few trolls who make threats or spam someone continuously or whatever else it might be. But rather than address the actual criticisms, the focus and the fixation has been on the supposed racism, sexism and whatever else of this broader community, which simply isn't there. And by writing them off, you're simply reinforcing and creating a feedback loop of their objections to your criticism. And it's not really criticism. When something like Sarkeesian's work or this paper implies or even explicitly says that games are dangerous, this is a call for censorship. There is a difference between criticism and censorship. Criticism is, I don't like this. Censorship is, this is dangerous and should not exist, or must change in a particular way to suit whatever the author's perspective is. The games, role-playing games, are always interpretive. You can turn them into whatever you want. And that is what a lot of the counter-critics are saying. We want people to be free to make what they want to make, to be left alone. And if you want something different, make it yourself. And the opportunity to do that has never been greater.
Don't you know you never split the party? Clerics in the back keep those fighters hale and hearty. The wizard in the middle where he can shed some light, and you never let that damn thief out of sight.